Many people think that the United States is past the point of no return. When we look at the sheer number of dollars that our federal government is spending every year, and the fact that it looks like that spending has no chance of doing anything but increasing, it does seem hopeless. It seems like there is nothing we can do but barrel forwards towards our inevitable collapse. But that is not the case. The financial situation the United States is actually very fixable. There are a few very simple changes that we could make, or that Congress could make very easily, that would result in very little pain, that would put us back on the path towards increasing our nation's wealth rather than wasting it away as quickly as possible. The reality is there is no free lunch. There's always a trade-off. You always have to ask, what's the cost? Because there's a very real cost of continuing on the path that we're going on, and that is ultimate financial collapse. There is actually a cost of fixing things, but the cost means a much greater return in the future. The reality is we will either be forced to stop this crazy spending at some point in the future when our nation collapses, or we can choose to stop this crazy spending right now, incur a very small amount of short-term pain, and watch our wealth start to rebound and become an extremely strong nation yet again. And I'm going to detail for you and show you, demonstrate to you exactly what simple little tiny changes need to take place to fix things right now. The Treasury always displays all of the information about where it's sending its money, but it always does so with a little twist. It never wants you to think about how much of your money it's spending on all these different areas, so it always displays things by default as percentages. But we can view these categories as dollar amounts to get a more accurate picture. And what we find is that there are two major categories for government spending. We've got mandatory spending and discretionary spending. Mandatory spending is spending that is mandated by existing laws. This includes things like Medicare, Social Security, and payments to state and local governments. This is considered mandatory because the law says that it is mandatory, but those laws were created and can be undone or amended or changed by Congress at any time. The other category is discretionary spending, which is formally approved by both Congress and the president every single year. Normally, this discretionary spending, about half of it goes to national defense and the other half of it goes to other categories. So let's take a look line by line at all the mandatory spending to see if there are any very simple changes that we could make. Then let's look at the discretionary spending and do the exact same. And for these, we're going to be entirely reasonable, and we are going to inflict as little pain as possible with bringing everything in line to where it needs to be. But don't worry, for all of you freedom lovers out there, at the end, I'm really gonna chop this thing to pieces. We're gonna get crazy and to show how we could accelerate our nation's recovery even faster. All right, coming in first place is Medicare with a whopping $747 billion spent. Don't worry, we're not going to touch that. That will stay exactly the same. I know there's a ton of people on the left and a ton of people on the right, mainly people who are all old and recipients of these transfer payments who want to keep that the same. So for right now, we'll leave it. Next on the list is Medicaid with a whopping $592 billion. Medicaid is actually better than Medicare because Medicaid at least is needs-based. And so if you need it, you can qualify, but if you don't need it, you can't qualify. So obviously we're gonna leave that one there as well. We've got another $103 billion for premium tax credits and other that is rounding out the category of major health care programs. So if you notice, that $1.4 trillion spent on health for mandatory outlays, we're not touching that at all. So no pain inflicted there whatsoever. The next category is Social Security that costs a whopping $1.2 trillion. That is made up of $1 trillion for old age and survivors insurance and $143 billion for disability insurance. This is the one that always makes it on the news, that's always the center of political attention, and so don't worry, we won't touch this one either. The next category is Income Security Programs, made up of earned income, child tax credits, supplemental nutrition assistance programs, supplemental security income, foster care, child nutrition, and unemployment compensation. And just like the other categories, don't worry, we're not touching any of this either. At this point, you're probably thinking, how in the world can you balance the budget when you haven't touched these massive categories where all of our spending goes? Don't worry, I'll show you, we still have room. The next category here, which you might not not see because they don't break it down on the right-hand column, is only showing up as a category, student loan programs, $482 billion. And here's where we find our first major slash. This gets cut to zero. First of all, there is nobody who will be subjected to pain as a result of these student loan programs going away. No seniors losing their income, no sick people losing their health care. This is simply transfer payments from borrowing from our future and transferring from the productive taxpayers to students who may or may not ever become productive taxpayers in the future. And given the fact that education has reduced its return on investment every year that the federal government has handed more and more money to it, this money is actually a negative payment on our future wealth. This is because every dollar the federal government gives to universities, they raise their price by at least $1. So this money doesn't make school cheaper for students. This just subsidizes all the extra administrators and all the wealth flooding into universities. And without this money, it won't make college more expensive. College will have to get cheaper and compete because students won't be able to afford those higher prices. So the prices will go back down to where they used to be before this money was coming into the universities. And if this means some students won't be able to go to college anymore, good. That means they won't be saddled with debt that they can't get out of even from bankruptcy for the rest of their lives just to get a job paying $50,000 a year that will never make enough to be able to make a dent in that $100,000 of student loans. This is absolutely preposterous that we are subsidizing the lowest income producing class in America, college students. They've got no income, no job, no proof that they ever will be able to make any production of wealth in their future. And we're using it to force them to load up on debt that they'll never be able to get out of. It's idiotic and it's got to stop now, and it will result in zero pain. The next category is federal civilian and military retirement benefits. And don't worry, that's not on the chopping block. That'll stay there. Same thing with veterans programs. Both veterans income security and other will stay there. Next up on the list, though, is this vague category called other programs that's costing us $345 billion. If we dial in on that, we see that it is programs enacted in response to the coronavirus pandemic and other. Get rid of it. It wasn't necessary before 2020. It's not necessary today. It's gone. Get rid of it. No pain. We're just returning to pre-2020 there. Now you might think that that didn't make that big of a dent, but let's do the math. Total mandatory outlays came in at $4.1 trillion. We subtracted $482 billion for student loan programs, and we're also subtracting $345 billion for those other programs that were started as a result of the coronavirus. That leaves us with mandatory spending of $3.2 trillion. Now, this $3.2 trillion number is significant. Why? Because during the year of 2022, the federal government received $4.9 trillion in taxes. So after all of our spending is said and done, we need to be under this number. And for 2023, the tax income will probably be $4.6 trillion. It's going to change every year, but we're using 2022 numbers so that we're comparing apples to apples. By the way, if you'd like to learn how to actually make money off of all these idiotic choices instead of going down with the boat, learn how to grow and protect your wealth, check out Heresy Financial University, linked in the description below. So we got the number for mandatory spending down to $3.2 trillion. And we did this without inflicting any pain on retirees, on seniors, on veterans, on sick people, nothing. We just eliminated the fat. So we're at $3.2 trillion worth of spending right now, and we're at $4.9 trillion worth of income. That leaves us quite a bit of wiggle room for discretionary spending. But before we move over to discretionary spending, we have to look at one piece that's often ignored, which is interest on the debt. During 2022, the federal government spent $475 billion on interest on its debt. And in all likelihood for 2023, that number is going to be around $650 billion. Year after that, about $750 billion, and it'll probably go up from there. So for our purposes here, let's just go ahead and use those 2023 numbers of around $650 billion for interest. We're at $3.2 trillion worth of spending. We're going to add $650 billion which leaves us with spending $3.9 trillion. That leaves us with just under $1 trillion left for our discretionary spending. Unfortunately, discretionary spending is sitting around $1.7 trillion at the moment. Remember, discretionary spending is not mandated by law, so this is every year they decide how much is going to go to the categories that lie in the discretionary spending category. We're at about $1.7 trillion, but we only have about $1 trillion left over in our budget. Can we do it? Well, yes, actually, we can do this very easily. We can see that we currently spend about $750 billion on defense. Now, this is probably going to make a lot of people upset, but that number should be a lot lower. Why is that? Because we're not at war. Congress, if I recall correctly, has not declared war. So why do we have military bases with troops stationed in every country on Earth? We are spending money that we do not have, bankrupting our nation to be the police force for the entire world? That is national suicide. Defense should be defense, not offense. And if the last 20 years have proven anything, it's that the only thing we end up doing by all of this foreign involvement and military occupation and bombings of countries all around the world is make things worse, not better for us. But what about the non-defense category? Well, we have $141 billion of spending on health. That's not Medicare, and that's not Medicaid, and that's not veteran stuff. That's just extra health stuff. That number should be zero. Why? Well, number one, it's not mandatory, but number two, all it does is drive up prices of healthcare for everybody else. Just like education, when the government floods a sector or an industry of an area of the economy with money, all that does is raise prices. Same thing with education, training, employment, and social services. The government has no business doing almost all of that. Community and regional development, natural resources and environment. These are things that if a government is going to do that, it should almost certainly be the state. And the state governments probably shouldn't even be doing that. If they want to, go ahead. That if somebody's going to do that, that should be local city governments, not the federal government. There's no skin in the game. They're too far removed. There's absolutely no reason why the federal government should be collecting money from across the nation and deploying it where it sees fit, doing a job that the local governments should be doing themselves. Essentially, what we have here for discretionary spending is a 40% to 50% cut across the board. Some of these categories should be cut to zero, but you can also just say, hey, everybody's going to take a 40% reduction. None of these are mandatory. None of these are necessary. These are things that are only bankrupting our nation. We have about $900 billion or $1 trillion to go in spending on discretionary outlays. And so it'd be relatively painless to cut spending evenly across the board and bring the troops home and end our foreign military occupation around the world for good. Turn our Department of Defense into defense again. If you were following along with the math, that would bring the federal government's spending exactly in line with tax revenue. That means no more deficits. No more adding to the debt. That means the government becomes a much smaller burden on the economy just by way of freeing up that capital into private citizens' hands. But it also means less transfers of capital, meaning instead of the government taking more money from this area and deploying it over there and causing a misallocation of resources, now everything can stay where it was supposed to stay in the first place. Like I said in the beginning, there is no such thing as a free lunch. There is always a trade-off. And while some of these changes would cause some very small pain, it's essentially just like starting to exercise and incurring a little bit of physical pain so you don't die of a heart attack at 50. The financial decisions that our politicians are making right now are quite literally going to cause our nation to collapse someday if they don't turn around now. And they can turn it around now. It's not too late. And making these changes would give us a balanced budget, no more deficits, no more increase to the national debt, and our country would actually start to be able to breathe again, and it would get on track. It would take a while, but we'd be able to recover. But for those of you who are like me and want to see the crazy option, I've got your back, because this option would cause a lot more temporary pain for a lot more people who are currently the recipients of handouts, of benefits that do not belong to them. And the sooner we can end that, the more wealthy and better off everybody will be. If we go back to this mandatory spending, the first line item of Medicare and the second line item of Medicaid, together that's about $1.4 trillion that the federal government is spending. The thing about Medicaid, like I said earlier, is that it's needs-based, meaning if somebody needs it because they don't have enough income, they can qualify for Medicaid. What about Medicare though? The only thing that Medicare does is it subsidizes the inheritances of rich kids. Let me say that again, because Medicare is not needs-based. You have somebody who has saved up their whole life, who has a retirement, who has a pension, who has a 401k, and instead of having to spend their own money on something that they've saved for in retirement, like healthcare, they're getting free money from the government. Then the government is paying for this stuff for them so they can keep their nest egg to pass it along to their heirs. And it's not the government's money. It's your money and it's my money that they're taking and giving to old people so the old people don't have to spend their massive nest egg that they already have. I am not advocating for leaving people high and dry. That's what Medicaid is for. It should all be needs-based. If an old person runs out of money and they can't afford healthcare anymore, that's what Medicaid is for. It should all be needs-based. Not removing the social safety net, fine, leave it there. But don't subsidize the inheritances of old rich people so they don't have to touch their nest egg and they get to live off the government. Because it's not living off the government. It's living off of you and me. And all you're doing is subsidizing that inheritance for their heirs. The next on the list is Social Security. $1.2 trillion that the government spends on this, and it's growing, and it's unfunded past 2033. Again, the money's not there. These are idiotic financial decisions, and a painful choice needs to be made right now. Otherwise, we will end up in ruin. A little bit of pain now or a lot of pain later on. Social Security is also not needs-based. It's just age-based, meaning that you might have $5 million in your 401k, and you might not need to touch it because you're able to live off your Social Security. Meanwhile, there's not enough money in Social Security. This is stupid, it's idiotic, and it's national suicide, and it needs to stop. All you're doing is subsidizing the inheritances of those rich kids instead of forcing old people who have money to spend their money to live on, which is the purpose of saving and investing throughout your life so that you have a nest egg. Instead of forcing them to spend that because it's theirs, we are subsidizing that. Keep your 401k. We'll transfer money from young people who have nothing, who are paying into this program, just to allow you to make sure your 401k doesn't decline and so you can pass more along to your kids. Not having it be needs-based is the height of stupidity. And again, I'm not suggesting removing that social safety net. We have something called supplemental security income, which is just like Social Security, it's just needs-based. So if you've got an old person who can't afford to live anymore, then suddenly they qualify for Social Security. But it is financial suicide to just be sending all these old people paychecks when we don't have the money. It's not there. And most of them already have enough to live on without the Social Security anyway. And if they don't, that's what the supplemental security is there for. Leave the social safety net. I'm not talking about putting anybody in poverty. I'm just talking about making the people who have money spend it instead of taking money away from the poor young people who are working and producing and giving it to old people who already have a massive retirement. And here's the big one. End the Fed, or actually amend the Federal Reserve Act. No more dual mandate of inflation and employment because they're not doing a good job of either of those. Best case scenario, a little bit of inflation over time that transfers wealth away from the poor to the rich. So you're going to nationalize or fold the Federal Reserve under the Treasury, amending the Federal Reserve Act, and have it be there for one purpose only, which is to eliminate the debt expense, meaning the Federal Reserve will loan money to the United States government at 30-year terms for zero interest rate in order to allow the US to refinance its debt without having these skyrocketing interest expenses. Instead of having these interest expenses go from $450 billion, $650 billion, $750 billion every single year go up, amend the Federal Reserve Act, refinance the debt with the Fed, eliminate that interest expense, and now you can shrink the spending even more because you're not wasting so much money on just interest. And once all that debt is refinanced, end the Fed. They're not needed. They only enable more government reckless spending. Now, I would say to send this video to your representative or your senator and show them, hey, like we can actually turn this boat around, but let's be honest. Nobody who is in office right now has the guts to say or do what is needed to do here. It's political suicide. So while it might not be possible to cause this massive boat to turn around on our own, it is very possible to jump in a lifeboat or to at least have a lifeboat ready. So if you want to learn how to make money off of all of this and actually get rich because of this, of these idiots that are bankrupting our nation, that's what Heresy Financial University is for. Join my membership program where you can learn all about how to grow and protect your wealth regardless of what economic storms may come. Link is in the description below. As always, really appreciate you guys. Thanks so much for watching. Have a great day.